All right, everyone, this is lesson 15, the birth of Sega. All right, what I want you to do is write for your discussion as a kid born in the early 2000s. What do you know of Sega? Have you ever heard of it? What do you know about it? Any sort of facts? I look forward to reading your responses when you submit your work. So, the meaning of Sega. Sega is not a Japanese word. It's actually an abbreviated form of the phrase service games. Although the company is headquartered in Japan and has a Japanese corporate culture, it was actually founded by Americans. The history of Sega can be divided into two stories. The first story is the story of Sega itself. The second story is the story of David Rosen, this guy in the bottom left corner. My dad was in Hawaii when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. He ran the slot machines on the bases. When they bombed Pearl Harbor, there was a note on one of the slot machines that said, "In case of another attack, jump under this machine." It's never been hit yet. Service games began in May of 1952. Marty Bromley managed game rooms with slot machines, pinball tables, and other coin-operated amusement devices on several military bases in the United States territory of Hawaii. In 1951, the laws had changed and the government confiscated these slot machines. Bromley and his father purchased them from the government and shipped them over to Japan. Here, they would set up game rooms for servicemen who were stationed over in Japan. By most accounts, Japan after the early 1950s was a third world nation. Their industries were greatly depleted during the war years. Many of their factories had been destroyed, and a large portion of their workforce had died. Japan's recovery was very, very slow. Bromley began trading. He branched out into jukeboxes and opened a manufacturing plant called Nippon Kakai Seizo. Bromley decided to merge his company with two fellow Americans, Dick Stewart and Ray Lemaire, and their company's Service Games was a major operation built on these military bases. Okay. David Rosen was tall and thickly built with a dark hair and strange, calm intensity that suggested the ability to carefully consider issues under any circumstance. He was friendly, yet intimidating. Rosen served in the U.S. Air Force during the Korean War. In 1951, he was stationed in the Far East. At the same time, Martin Bromley was starting his slot machine business. While serving in Japan, Rosen came to believe that Japanese people were too industrious to remain in their present circumstances. He saw potential, and he begins his business over there before being discharged from the Air Force. My first business was actually involved in art, strangely enough, which was about as far from the current business as you could be. In those years, Japan was still in economic post-war strata, and consequently, there was still a lot of unemployment at the time. A lot of the artists were doing portrait painting based on photos. I established a company in the U.S. that sent photos back to Japan to be made into portraits. When his portrait business failed, Rosen decided to return to Japan and start a brand new business. People in Japan had a great need for ID photos. You would need an ID for school applications, rice ration cards, railway cards, and employment. In 1953, photo studios were charging 250 yen, and it took about 2 or 3 days to have the photos completed. But that was no good if you needed food or you needed to travel to work, right? Rosen wanted to capitalize on this issue by creating an ID printing business whose photo could last 4 to 5 years. Rosen would charge 150 to 200 yen, and the photo would be developed in 2 to 3 minutes instead of 3 to 4 days. The company was named 2 Minute Photo, and in Japanese it was Nippon Shishin, and the company was later named Photorama. Rosen's Photorama was very successful, so successful that Photorama became a licensed franchise and was the first franchising business in Japan. However, Rosen didn't patent this Photorama technology, and other companies moved into the market and stole his idea. Rosen decides to move on to a new business venture and import American products. Okay. So you have to import things through METI, or the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. And to get a license, based on what you were bringing into the country, you would fall into 3 categories. Absolute necessities like oils and food, non-necessities but something desirable, and the third one was for luxury. Rosen decided to import a limited number of luxury items, and he chose coin-operated electromechanical games. With the exception of pinball, the amusement industry had gone flat, creating a buyer's market, which meant distributors were glad to sell unused games to Rosen at bargain rates. He paid $200 per game instead of their traditional rate of about $1,000. Most of the games were imported were shooters like Bear Gun, which you see on the left-hand side here. And due to the wild success of Fotorama, Rosen still owned hundreds of buildings in Japan where he could place these machines. He would charge 20 yen per game, and at the time, the trade rate was 360 yen to $1, which meant 20 yen is less than 10 cents per play. Rosen paid less than $1,000 to import each machine to Japan. Even though he charged less than 10 cents per play, it took less than 2 months for him to earn back the entire $100,000 investment, which is insane. Within a year, his license was doubled to 200,000, and he had at least one arcade in every city in Japan. His closest rival was Service Games, which by the time had cornered the jukebox market with Sega jukeboxes. That is right, a Sega jukebox. After the success of his arcades, Rosen searched for new ways to expand his business. He tried indoor golf, slot cars, and finally a bowling alley. He opens the first ever bowling center in Japan, and he chose the high traffic area in Tokyo, Shinjuku. However, the only way that Rosen could find a space for 14 lanes of bowling was to build it on top of an existing movie theater. Imagine that. You're in the movies and you're hearing bowling balls rolling above you. This was a real challenge because the president of that theater chain was a friend of mine. We had to do this without affecting the theater. No vibrations and no noise. But until we rolled the first ball down the lane, we really couldn't be sure that it was going to work. This bowling center went on to establish records in the bowling industry. A typical U.S. bowling alley would do 40 to 45 lines per day. His bowling alley in Tokyo did 110 lines per day. They were only closed for 4 hours each day from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. So, Taito, Service Games, and Rosen Enterprises discuss a three-way merger, bringing all three companies together. Taito backs out of the merger, but Service Games and Rosen Enterprises join forces to form Sega Enterprises. Under the new agreement, Rosen becomes the CEO of Sega. In 1966, they create their first game, Periscope, which was an attack submarine simulation. Players scanned a stretch of the ocean through the periscope, then fired torpedoes at ships as they crossed the horizon. The ocean was a wide bed of plastic that looked like a windy wave-tossed sea, and the torpedoes were really only strings of light, but Periscope had great sound effects, and that's something that's going to stick with Sega for a long time. Great sound. Cost 30 yen to play and was so successful that distributors from the United States and Europe flew to Japan to see it. They would charge $1,295 per unit. U.S. operators complained that Sega wanted too much money and that $1,200 games would never pay for itself. So he said, why don't you make them 25 cents per play instead of 10? And that's where the first game ever to be set at 25 cents came about. Okay. Sega became so successful that offers from other companies were too large to refuse, and Sega was purchased by Gulf and Western Inc. Rosen remained chairman and CEO, but the other two business associates, Bromley and Lemaire, start Segasa of Spain. At this time, Sega acquires an arcade company called Gremlin, and they work together to establish themselves as major supplier of video games in the US and Europe. While profits kept rising in the early 80s, I became very concerned about the economics of the industry. Rosen partners with Paramount, and Sega headquarters were moved to the Paramount Studio lot. Barry Diller, who was the chairman, and Michael Eisner, maybe someone you know from Disney, who was the president of Paramount at the time, joined the Sega board. Gulf and Western sold Sega's U.S. assets to Bally Midway, and they sell the Japanese operation back to Rosen for $38 million. After the buyback, Hayao Nakayama, becomes CEO of Sega and decides to diversify Sega's activities to include home products. Nintendo had already launched the Famicom, so Sega turned to America.